Justin excited.
Mine was, I don't really want to grade those 41 papers that are on my desk. Okay, so a few quick, just not announcements, but just the schedule for today. There is only one handout. When I started putting together the stuff on limbic system and emotion and trying to toss in some things on learning and memory, it was hard to do all of the background in like the hour and 10 minutes that we get here and do all application at the end. I haven't done this lecture, so I just thought there's one handout, we're gonna get as far as we can until it's time to go to lab, and we'll finish the rest hopefully when we come back after lunch. So it's not split like it normally is, although we will end more with disorders, like we typically do. The other thing is lab's gonna run a little bit different today. If you take a look just real quick at your lab guide, it's only one page. The goal for today is not to find new structures. What we're going to be talking about with the limbic system, you've already found most of those structures. You found the amygdala before, you found the hippocampus, you found the hypothalamus. So there's not a lot of new structures to find. So what each group will be responsible for are 2 bullets. Either 2 slides out of the brainstem notebook or a slide out of the brainstem notebook and something off of one of the models. And your goal is today to familiarize yourself with that and develop a very short PowerPoint that you can deliver to the rest of the class next week. So next week will be review week. Today is your week to prepare your part of that review or your group's part of that review to develop an 8 to 10 minute PowerPoint that you can show the rest of the class next week. So that will be our lab next week. From 10:30 to 12, we'll be each group presenting very briefly on their content, their material, and then the second half of class, the 1 to 2 slot, will be open lab downstairs. So that is your in-class time to prepare for your lab practical, which is the following week, okay? So, any other questions before we get started? Quiz grade will work the same as last week. I'll grade these, and if it's higher than a previous quiz grade, I will substitute that in Blackboard. If not, your grades are as they are for the quizzes. This was your last quiz. Anything else? Okay then. So again, we're talking about mechanisms of emotion, and we'll kind of throw in some aspects of learning and memory, although we just don't have time in this curriculum to do that, to do it full justice. So there are a lot of aspects of learning and memory that you aren't going to get in this class. Hopefully Tony will touch on them. He's very big on cognition, so when you get into next semester, I think you'll get a lot more of that. But again, we're talking about emotions today, and there really are 2 very basic components of emotion. One are the subjective feelings that we feel. We feel sad, we feel joyful. And the work by Paul Ekman and colleagues has really shown that there are 6 emotions that tend to transcend culture. Those being disgust, fear, joy, anger, sadness, and surprise. You didn't get her own character in this movie, but surprise is the 6th sort of universal emotion. And if you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend it. It's worth blowing off studying for hours. You might actually learn something. You can justify it by saying it relates to this class. So there is that sense of what we feel. I feel sad. I feel joyful. But there's also the physiological state that tends to go along with the various emotions. And that's just as important. Some people think more important is how our body responds, what that feeling is like, not only cerebrally, but that feeling that we get throughout our body. And there's been a lot of research on those states as well. And this graph was in the handout, the chapter that I gave you, but I don't think it was in color, so it probably didn't make a whole lot of sense in black and white. But this was research that was done in Finland, but it was across cultures. So I think they looked at people in Finland, Sweden, and Taiwan maybe. And they asked people to describe where they felt emotion. So if they were experiencing sadness or surprise, where do you feel it? And the color coding is that the warm colors, the yellows, the oranges, the reds, are areas where people felt that an emotion made that part of the body more active. So they felt it more, it made that part of the body, either the brain or the heart, the chest, more active. Whereas the cool colors represent less activity. They felt that that particular emotion resulted in less activity in that part of the body. So again, it's not an exact science by any mean, but it starts to give us information about sort of across cultures, across within the human species, that there are these experience of emotions that tend to be similar, and also that the physiological responses that happen in conjunction with those emotions also tend to be similar. So that physiological component of emotion can be divided really into two separate things. One is what we typically think of as our physiological responses, which are the autonomic nervous system or visceral motor changes. These would be things like increases in heart rate or respiratory rate, changes in motility in the gastrointestinal system, butterflies in the stomach or sweating of the palms. These are things that happen as a result of the hypothalamus being activated and the autonomic nervous system being activated. And that's what we're talking about next week. So we're not going to talk about those specific mechanisms today, but those are really important. They're important also in changing our level of arousal in response to emotion. And this is something you've probably seen before in a psychology class. It used to be more symmetrical, but it was called the Yerkes-Dodson curve. And it's the idea that our performance, which is here on the vertical axis, changes or is influenced by our arousal level. That if arousal levels are too low, performance is diminished or is less than optimal. But the same thing happens if arousal levels are too high. If we're too anxious or we're too stressed about something, we can't perform optimally. That a certain level of arousal is needed for optimal performance, but again, if we go too far, performance diminishes. And this seems to be the role of this autonomic nervous system in preparing the organism for action, which is really the role of the ANS. Again, we'll talk about that more next week. The other physiological or motor aspect of emotion relates to the somatic motor system. And that's just a fancy word for saying all those motor pathways that we've been talking about. It's how our muscles and our body respond to an emotion, or how they respond in general. But in relation to emotion, when we are happy, when we are sad, when we are angry, we tend to communicate that through things like facial expressions or gestures. If I'm angry, I'm probably going to be doing something like this. If I'm happy, I'm probably going to be smiling. If I'm sad, I'm probably not going to be smiling. So we have these responses that are elicited fairly involuntarily due to emotional regulation. And I'll talk a little bit more about those descending inputs of the limbic system in a few slides. But again, these are the two primary components, the physiological or autonomic responses that we see, and then the communicative motor responses. And Darwin believed that particularly that second piece, those emotional, communicative signals were universal across human species. So that because emotions have a universal expression, that all humans encode and decode expressions in the same way, and that emotional expressions are directed towards self-preservation. And what this means that humans encode and decode expressions in the same way is that not only do most of us smile when we see a really cute little baby walking through the hall, but we also can interpret each other's smiles as, oh look, she thinks the baby is cute, or she's happy that there's a cute baby in the hallway. So that we not only express those emotions ourselves, but we identify those emotions in other people. So in looking at photographs, and several researchers have done this again cross cultures, but looking at, we would all pretty much interpret this little girl's smile and affect as being one of joy, if you had to put it into a category. Now, I always do really bad at these, which is probably why I'm somewhere on the spectrum, but I would guess that this little person, girl, boy, I don't know, really bad. He looks kind of angry, maybe disgusted. I would put him somewhere in that category. And this little one seems sad because she's crying. But, we're all decent. We all are fairly good at being able to categorize emotions. based on these types of facial expressions and body postures as well, which you see in the second two pictures more than the others. And again, Darwin kind of thought that these behaviors were important for preservation, that we needed to communicate our emotions to others as an aspect of survival. And we see this more in animals when we think about like anger or aggression, the posturing that they do, the hissing, the communicative function of those sort of defensive behaviors. They may have become less important over time because as humans we're much better at verbalizing how we feel, though not always. Interestingly, and this is what I said I was going to talk a little bit more about, but facial expression can be altered not only by damage to those tracts that we've talked about that control facial expression. What's the tract that comes to mind when I say motor tract that controls facial expression? Cortical bulbar. Excellent. All right, you guys are on it today. But if we have damage to regions other than so cortico-bulbar tract starts in the motor cortex, travels through the travels through the internal capsule, travels through the cerebral peduncles, and synapses somewhere in the brainstem, right? Anywhere along that track can cause voluntary facial paralysis. Sorry, I'll point with my pointer versus my finger. That's what we typically think about when people have a difficulty with facial expression. But limbic structures, and I'll define limbic a little bit later on, but structures that are either subcortical in the limbic system or the hypothalamus project to those same lower motor neurons for facial musculature, and they do that via the thalamus usually. So damage to either what they're calling here the pyramidal tracts, but we're really talking about cortico-bulbar tracts, right? Or extrapyramidal structures outside of that primary motor system can cause changes in activation of facial muscles. And that's what the cartoon is showing us. So there's two examples here. The woman is a woman who's had an MCA stroke. And you don't get to see the picture of her at rest, but if you looked at her at rest, you would see asymmetry. You would see facial weakness on her right, and more tone with the facial musculature on the left. When she's asked to voluntarily show her teeth, so voluntary motor action, this is what she does, and you can see normal tone and response here on the left side of her face, and facial weakness or paralysis on the right side of her face. However, her limbic structures have not been damaged, and therefore, when you elicit an involuntary smile response, Tara brings in her cute baby, you get greater symmetry in the facial musculature because this pathway is still intact. Alternatively, if you have what they call emotional facial paralysis, which is damage to this pathway from limbic structures through the thalamus to those lower motor neurons, if you looked at this guy at rest, you would see facial symmetry. You wouldn't see any differences. Corticobulbar still intact, tone still intact. If you ask him to voluntarily show his teeth, even though he's making this angry face, this is not dysfunctional. All right, we're just looking at symmetry. We have symmetry. He's symmetrical. He's showing his teeth equally, facial muscles moving equally on both sides of the face. However, if you elicit an involuntary smile response, here's where you see the asymmetry. Normal tone and movement on the left side of his face, and slight paralysis or weakness on the right side. I wouldn't even call it weakness, but disactivation or failure to activate the muscles on the right side of his face. And again, this is due to extrapyramidal or disruption of this extrapyramidal tract, resulting in emotional facial paralysis. So the important point to all of this is that lesions, where the lesion occurs is going to result in two distinct, anatomically and functionally distinct facial expressions or elicitation of facial expressions. And that's how you would test that clinically to try and figure out where the lesion occurred. Does that make sense? emotion also tends to be lateralized in the brain, meaning left side of the brain and the right side of the brain tend to do different things related to emotional processing. The left side of the brain seems to be more important for processing positive moods or positive emotions. And therefore, when we see lesions or deficits occurring in the left hemisphere, we're more likely to see symptoms of depression. Alternatively, right side of the brain seems to be more important for processing negative emotions. And lesions on the right side of the brain may lead to behaviors of, and here it says extreme cheerfulness. Sometimes we don't see extreme cheerfulness. Sometimes we just see what I would refer to as the I don't give a shit attitude. Okay? So not necessarily a fully flattened affect, but really not bothered by anything attitude. And part of this is the reason why, and your book talks about this. This is more just background information, but why they thought frontal lobotomies were a good idea. Let's stick a rod or an ice pick and just knock out that part of the brain, really the prefrontal cortex, but that processes these negative emotions. Because then, if you're depressed and we knock this out, you should be really happy all the time. Unfortunately, the right brain also does a lot of other things that are important for emotional expression. So not only did you maybe, if you did this frontal lobotomy, get rid of some of the depressive symptoms, they also may have like an I don't give a shit attitude. They may also have difficulty with expression or comprehension of emotional aspects of speech. And this is called a prosodia. And I don't know if I'm saying that right, but that was my best try. But if I'm talking to you like this, most of you, I hope, understand that is my angry voice, right? I remember saying to my son before, don't you understand this is my angry voice? And there I'm gesturing with it, right? If I got like this flat look, like I would have to raise my voice. But again, like generally, we are able to interpret based on tone and intonation and all of that kind of stuff, how somebody else is feeling, what their emotion is. So damage to the left hemisphere can lead to prosodia, which is an inability or a difficulty being able to comprehend or interpret nuances of speech. The right hemisphere also seems to be important for that visual assessment of facial expression. So looking at those Darwin pictures, being able to identify, is this person happy? Are they sad? Are they angry? And then the expression of emotion through facial musculature also seems to be more driven by the right hemisphere. And interestingly, if we look at, main point here is that the right hemisphere seems to play a greater role in the perception of and expression of emotion. But again, looking at that last bullet, that the right hemisphere seems to be important for facial expression. If we look at people's facial expressions, they tend to be left-faced. So the right hemisphere controlling the left facial musculature seems to be more dominant. So that if this is, if you're having a hard time orienting, this is the left side of their face, this is the right side of her face, and we know Hillary's happy because she won New York last night. But Elvis is happy too, and he's showing greater expression on the left side of the face compared to the right. So you can look at your partners and smile. Look at somebody next to you, smile, and you can see if this holds true. It's probably more involuntary than a voluntary smile. It may work better if you elicit it involuntarily, so that'll be your task for today, is to make somebody else smile and look at their face when you do it. Alright, so again, this was in the chapter I asked you guys to read, but background, sort of the theories of emotion have driven, over the last decade at least, kind of our understanding, our beliefs about emotions. And up until the late 19th century, the belief was sort of that, and again, these are all very linear models, but that an event or a stimulus occurred. So, somebody throws a snake at you. That you would experience a subjective emotional experience of fear. I am fearful of this snake. And that secondarily, I'm going to have a physiological response. My heart rate goes up. So I am scared, therefore my heart rate goes up. That was the thought. And then James and Lang, these are two different people that work together, came along, and they believed that the subjective experience of emotion was secondary to the physiological expression. So that, in the quotations, we feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble. So in their linear model, somebody throws a snake at you, your physiological response is to have your heart rate go up or to tremble, and you interpret your heart rate going up and your trembling as a subjective feeling of fear. Right? So kind of flipping things around. The physiology comes first, and then we sort of interpret, well, how did that make me feel? And then again, two other researchers in the 1920s came along and they said, you know what? It doesn't make sense that it's always one before the other. They were able to prove that in various situations you could flip those things around. And they said that the event happened, sorry, where's my arrow? The event happened, somebody throws a snake at you, you have the subcortical processing that occurs across multiple structures, and then the physiological response and the subjective feeling happen simultaneously. They happen at the same time. So we can look at that in this model. Again, they're in the same order that I presented them, that there's a stimulus, in this case a barking dog. We say, dog scares me, I feel fearful, and then we have an autonomic response to it. James Lang theory is stimulus occurs, my heart rate goes up, or I get, butterflies in my stomach or whatever. I interpret that as the feeling of fear. And then the Cannon-Barr theory is, the stimulus occurs, and at the same time, I feel the feeling of fear while all of these physiological changes happen. And again, all of these theories have some merit, and there are situations where you could say, yes, this seems to be the correct sequence, or this seems to be what's happening. However, it's over time been thought that this is a fairly limited way of thinking about emotions or emotional expressions, that they're probably not this clean cut and this linear. And so more recent theories are looking at a dimensional approach or a dynamic approach to understanding emotions. And this year, again, this was in your readings, but examples of the dimensions of emotion include things like valence, how pleasant or unpleasant we think something is, and this leads into our motivation of do we want to go after this thing, do we not want to go after this thing, how is this going to make me feel? Again, the arousal aspect of emotions, and not just what is the physiological response, but how strong is that response? Something like anger occurs across a dimension of being very angry and, just a little pissed off. So we can look at these things again, not just as an if-then, but on a scale of strong to weak. And those are the two that we'll look at in the next slide. But a third part of that dimension is, well, what do we do about it? Based on our arousal levels, based on our subjective feelings, what is our action? And so do we approach the situation? Do we avoid it? And what is that expressive communication piece of what is my body doing in response to it? So we can look at this model here, which is a two-dimensional model with valence, again, pleasantness, unpleasantness, across the vertical axis, with, negative valence or unpleasantness more down towards the bottom and positive valence up towards the top. And on the horizontal axis is arousal, low arousal or high arousal. So emotions that have a high valence or a positive valence would be things like joy, surprise, or contentment. And we can kind of rank these according to, again, their arousal. So a surprise, happy birthday is usually going to be something, if it's truly a surprise, is going to elicit a high level of arousal. Whereas something like contentment with, yay, this is okay, I don't have a quiz next week for neuro, I mean, you're not doing jumping jacks over that, it's good. And similarly with emotions that have more of a negative valence, there are those that have a low arousal associated with them, that would be things like boredom, sadness, or disgust, and emotions that have a higher arousal associated with them, like shame, anger, and fear. So again, it's just a different way of thinking about these that is slightly more dimensional than the James Lang or the Canton-Bard theories. The other piece of this is to put the action dimension in, and it's really hard to show this in 3D, but picture that green arrow kind of going in the z-axis. I think that's right, because it's people's z-axis. Where here's our snake. We know it's going to make us be fearful. And again, if you like snakes and it's your buddy going, hey, you want to hold my cobra? And you're like, cool. You may not have a fearful response to that, but if you're walking, on a regular hike in the Shenandoah Valley and a snake pops out of the bushes at you, you're likely to have a fear response. And a surprise maybe too, but fear, which is going to be high arousal and a somewhat negative valence. I think my snake valence would be down here, more negative. But that's going to help us determine our action. And again, action can be approach avoidance. Am I going to just book it and get as far away from the snake as possible? Am I going to be curious and try to pick it up with a stick? I don't know. But that our emotional response, our arousal response, our valence response can help determine the action as well. So again, just a different way of understanding how emotions are being conceptualized. And again, I think this is the most current sort of way of conceptualizing the components of emotion. Again, we still believe that it's important how we are interpreting or appraising the emotion, that subjective response, I feel like this. We still have the importance of the arousal response, the physiological and the somatic motor response. But then there's also the communicative actions or behaviors that are associated with those responses, and that this isn't necessarily linear. So, knowing that emotions are complex and multidimensional, we need to start thinking about, well, where do these things get processed within the brain? And one way of thinking about it is that subcortical structures, so those structures below the cortex, like the hypothalamus and the amygdala, are important for processing hot emotions. So things that elicit very strong arousal systems, like the fight or flight response. With the snake, do I run away or do I try and defend myself against it? But these would be things like anger or fear, which are processed mainly in these two structures. But then we can think about what the term they use is cold cognition. So our ability to really rationalize those emotions. Do I need to be this fearful of this snake that popped its head out of a bush? Maybe, maybe not. Do I need to be so angry at whatever the situation is? So we're able to, on a higher level, interpret our emotions and the situation surrounding those emotions. And that allows our cortex, and we'll talk about what specific areas of the cortex in a few minutes, but it allows them to modulate these lower level brain structures. So we're going to see that areas, particularly of the prefrontal cortex up here, send descending inputs down to structures like the amygdala and to the hypothalamus to say, whoa there, I understand that this is our gut reaction to the situation, but I don't think it needs to be this big. I think we've got this under control now. And we're able to, again, modulate those hot emotions through our cortical systems. And the cortex also gives us this emotional intelligence, which allows us to read a situation, to read other other people and to make emotionally intelligent decisions about how we should respond in situations. And so we'll talk about this aspect, the cortical aspect, a little bit more when we talk about prefrontal cortex. I just want to hit quickly on, when we talk about hot emotions and fight or flight response, the hypothalamus, because this is really where those autonomic responses are housed. And next week we are talking mainly about the autonomic and neuroendocrine systems, which means we will be coming back to the hypothalamus. But it is important because almost all of our limbic structures that we're going to talk about today project to the hypothalamus. And so there are a variety of structures, including our cortex, including our amygdala, that project to the hypothalamus that say, do this, increase heart rate, slow digestion, whatever. And so the hypothalamus is important, we know, for the physiological expression of emotion. Not so much the interpretation or the subjective feeling of emotion, but the physiological expression of emotion. All right, that's really important to distinguish because we've talked about two aspects of emotion, the subjective feeling and the physiological expression. The hypothalamus is important for that physiological expression of emotion. And it does this primarily by targeting brainstem structures, especially the reticular formation, which it says here. And you can see, I don't know if they mark reticular in this specific model, but it's going to be throughout this area of the brainstem, medullary and pontine reticular formation. It's also going to synapse directly on places like the vagal nucleus, the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagal nucleus, which is sometimes called the nucleus ambiguus. I mentioned that one last week. So the vagus nerve is going to be important for controlling heart rate and respiratory rate. So the hypothalamus is going to have direct projections to those neurons that control the viscera, like the heart. And these studies really, the details of these studies really are important, but they just show that even not quite not quite 100 years ago, but almost, that studies were being done that showed that stimulating the hypothalamus did things like increase heart rate, blood pressure, GI motility, and were associated with the behaviors that we tend to associate those specific responses with, like anger or rage or fear. So again, you don't need to know the details of these, but just early references.
Did they just go around shocking regular cats for that second study?
No, I don't think so. I think it was in a laboratory. Probably had to have some type of approval by the institutional board, but yeah, I do think that they had regular old cats that they, yeah. There's a lot more controls for research now than there ever used to be, both for humans and for animals. The main emotion that the hypothalamus is associated with, more so the processing versus the expression of, is anger. And I do think your chapter also talked a little bit about hypothalamic lesions or stimulation, that if you stimulate parts of the hypothalamus, you can elicit types of anger and aggressive behavior, which shows that the hypothalamus does play some role in our experience of anger versus just the expression of anger. Does that make sense? Because we're trying to distinguish the two. And similarly, if you lesion the hypothalamus, you can get placidity. So a failure really to generate an anger response when you would expect to see that behavior. So again, we're going to come back to hypothalamus next week. We'll look more at some of the specific autonomic pathways, but for the rest of this morning's lecture and what we'll spill over into the afternoon, I really want to focus on what has typically been referred to as the limbic system. And you will see in some readings the hypothalamus we know is a diencephalic structure. It is sometimes grouped as part of the limbic system. The way we're going to talk about it today is the hypothalamus is an important structure related to limbic function, but it's not necessarily a limbic structure. Structures of the limbic system project to the hypothalamus. But the hypothalamus sort of stands alone as its own thing, and it has multiple Broca's area, if you guys are interested. And the term limbic comes from the Latin meaning border. So he identified that the structures that bordered or made a ring around the brainstem, which you can picture coming through here, all communicated to each other and were important in some way. But he didn't talk about them as being important to emotion. He talked about them really being as important to olfactory processing or smell. But the structures that he identified were the cingulate gyrus, which extends along here, the medial surface of the temporal lobe, which would be here-ish, and the hippocampus, which lies deep to the temporal lobe, deep to the medial temporal lobe. So those were really the structures that he identified as being limbic, or relating to that term limbic, but didn't talk about them as being important to emotion. About 50 years later, James Papez comes in and he says, these structures do seem to be connected, but I think they're important for stuff other than smell. I think they're important in processing of emotion or emotional experiences. And he established predicted, hypothesized the Papez circuit of emotional expression. And importantly, in this model, the cingulate gyrus, he believed, determined the experience of the emotion. So cingulate gyrus here, also down here, and in this loop here, was important for the experience of emotion. Again, that subjective experience. I feel this way. And he believed that emotional expression, as we just talked about, was really governed by the hypothalamus, which in this model was referred to as the mammillary bodies, but he's really referring to the bigger structure of the hypothalamus. And so that's here. So we have the experience of the emotion and the expression of the emotion represented in this model, and that they are bidirectional. That again, one is informing the other, is informing the other through this circuit. And the other structures he identified in the circuit, and I'll just go down the list, actually go through the model, would be the cingulate gyrus projects to the hippocampus via the cingulum, which isn't really important for you to know, but it's just a white matter tract that connects the cingulate gyrus to a variety of limbic structures. The hippocampus via the fornix projects to the hypothalamus, again, sort of mammillary bodies and hypothalamus. From the mammillary bodies, via the mammillothalamic tract, it projects to the anterior thalamic nuclei, back to the cingulate gyrus via the anterior limb of the internal capsule. So that's the full loop, with the exception that he also said that the neocortex was communicating with the cingulate gyrus to help in that experience of emotion. But it was the cingulate gyrus that was really the house or the seat of that experience. Because there's this bidirectional relationship between the hypothalamus and the cingulate gyrus, his circuit fell in or aligned with all of those theories, those linear theories that we talked about in the beginning of class. So it falls in line with that traditional view that we experience an emotion and then we subjectively feel an emotion and then we experience it physiologically. And it also plays into the idea that we have the physiological response first, and that helps us determine the emotional experience. So that doesn't really matter, but just this circuit fell in line with those linear theories of the time. It really didn't prove or disprove any of them, which kind of made everybody go, hey, this is great, this must be true. Zach, you had a question.
I just want to make sure what's the same text below cingulate gyrus.
This one?
No, further up with the red box.
Oh, it just says includes retrosplenial cortex, which means this is the splenium of the corpus callosum. So it means that this area of the cingulate gyrus was also included in his model. Okay, so Papez's circuit was kind of like, Anatomical studies showed that Papez's circuit was anatomically correct, that the structures here are actually anatomically linked. So that was good for Papez. Way to go, buddy. However, you know, a lot of what he based this model on were disease models. And so he said, okay, well, people who got infected with the rabies virus had sort of unchecked or uncontrolled fear and aggressive type behaviors. Their emotional system was out of whack. And also, when you looked at the post-mortem brains of people who had the rabies virus, their hippocampus here was degenerated in some way. And so we went, well, the hippocampus must be important for emotional processing because it's messed up in this disease that has emotional dysfunction. That was sort of his rationale for these structures and making sense of these structures in relation to emotional processing. And that just didn't quite work out. That as they started to do more research onto or into what the role of all of those structures in Papez's circuit were, the punchline is that they really came to find out that Papez's circuit likely plays more of a role in memory processing than it does in any level of emotional experience. And some of the studies that they did are what's represented in the slide, that if they looked at people or animals that had bilateral lesions to the hippocampus, what they saw was not a deficiency in emotional processing or emotional functioning. What they saw was an inability to form new memories or to remember things that happened recently. And that's called anterograde amnesia. And I'm assuming you've heard these terms before, mid-lecture site, something like that. So anterograde amnesia, an inability to learn or form new memories. But past memories remain intact. If you take out most of Papez's circuit, including mammillary bodies, the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, and the hippocampus, this relates to something called Korsakoff syndrome, which is both anterograde and retrograde amnesia. So not only the inability to form new memories, but the inability to remember things that have happened in the past. And so again, the punchline here is that Papez's circuit does seem to be essential for formation of memories and recall of past events. It does not seem to be especially important in emotional processing. It doesn't mean that structures like the cingulate gyrus or the hypothalamus aren't important. They do still seem to play a role. Again, the cingulate gyrus in the experience of emotion is connected with the amygdala and other structures that we'll talk about. And we know the hypothalamus is important in the expression, the physiological expression of emotion. But the circuit itself, this circuit, and the structures like the anterior nucleus of the thalamus and the hippocampus are much more important for memory, learning and memory, but particularly memory formation and memory retrieval. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with research that's been done in the last 50 or so years that tells us that there are other structures that form the limbic system that are involved in this system of emotional processing that are more important to the experience of emotion and emotion regulation. And those structures are the amygdala, which they're all boxed here in green. So we know the amygdala is that almond-shaped structure that sort of sits anterior to the hypothalamus. It doesn't look very, it looks more pear-shaped in this picture. Almond-shaped, we're going to go with that. The nucleus accumbens, which is part of the basal ganglia, because it's not associated really with motor functioning, we didn't talk about it when we did our big basal ganglia lecture. We will talk about it more today. The orbital and medial prefrontal cortices, which we talked about orbital frontal cortex, but not so much the medial prefrontal cortex, but it's this area really of the frontal lobe. And the medial dorsal nucleus of the thalamus, which is really a relay center for the limbic system. And we won't talk about it in isolation today, but it does seem to be an important stop for projecting inputs and outputs to the limbic system. So again, these structures are thought to be much more important than what Papez originally identified, or what Broca originally identified as limbic. a newer, more current view of those four structures. And if we look at them here, it's the amygdala, aspects of the prefrontal cortex. The ventral basal ganglia is really referring to that nucleus accumbens, if you want to make a note there about that. And the medial dorsal nucleus of the thalamus, that's sometimes abbreviated as the MD nucleus of the thalamus. The thought is that these structures and this circuit, if you want to call it that, but these relationships are particularly important because these two structures, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, really work together to guide higher level emotional behaviors. And that the amygdala has access to neocortical regions that guide things like executive functions, decision making, judgments, social behaviors related to our emotions, and strategies for how to approach situations. Those are all really roles of the prefrontal cortex that I'll define in a few slides, but it gives us this interrelationship between our prime emotional areas and those areas that influence decision making, and also that those areas that influence decision making can project back to those subcortical structures. So this is more of a big picture slide. We'll kind of take it apart as we go. Again, we have 10 minutes, we'll go as far as we can, and then we'll do the rest in the afternoon. So the prefrontal cortex, again, we've touched on in other lectures. It is, as the 3D model is showing you, part of the frontal cortex. And we've talked about the orbital frontal cortex, which is the area kind of underneath. And the medial prefrontal cortex is the region in here. All of it is important, but I'm going to talk about two specific areas, the orbital frontal and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex on the next slide. Input to this area comes from all over. The prefrontal cortex is getting projections from almost all areas of the cortex, including all sensory cortices. So it's getting processed information about sensation, about motor aspects, about vision from all regions of the cortex. It's also getting multiple projections from other limbic structures. So here we see it's getting projections from the amygdala and from the MD nucleus of the thalamus, probably other parts of the limbic system as well. And its main role that we're going to see, main two roles, is to influence activity of the hypothalamus, either via indirect connections to the MD nucleus and the amygdala, which both project to the hypothalamus, or direct projections to the hypothalamus. So again, prefrontal cortex is going to be involved in some aspects of experiencing the emotion, but more importantly, it's going to be directing that physiological response, how the hypothalamus should respond in relation to whatever's going on in the world. Another important projection is this one here, going from the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala. And I referred to this earlier, that the higher level centers of the cortex, the prefrontal cortex, have a modulatory role on subcortical structures, like the amygdala. And let's think about this in relation to the teen brain that we talked about last semester in development. It was this area, the prefrontal cortex, that was the last to develop, right? Yes? So, the prefrontal cortex, we know, in adults is important for modulating emotions, for saying, keeping anger in check, keeping fear in check, keeping all of these emotions sort of, equal to the demands of the situation. So what happens in teens when amygdala is fully functional, but the prefrontal cortex isn't quite online yet? It's not fully myelinated, it's not fully working. Well, what we see in teenagers are these emotions that seem to be disproportional to the demands of the situation, or the realities of the situation. We see emotions that go unchecked. Again, it's because this link here from the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala is not quite fully functional yet. And when we see damage to this area of the prefrontal cortex, we can potentially see deficits in emotional regulation because we lose that primarily inhibitory modulatory control or regulation. I said I wanted to talk about two parts, or have you be familiar with two parts of the prefrontal cortex that seem to be most important to emotional processing. And those are the orbital frontal cortex, which again is part of the prefrontal cortex, and the medial prefrontal cortex. And within the medial prefrontal cortex, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, sometimes abbreviated VM, PFC, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, seem to be the most important. So we've already talked about the orbital frontal cortex. We did that in the taste smell lecture. Right? I know that was a long time ago, but we talked about it as being an area that integrates, receives, integrates, encodes, and evaluates sensory information. And primarily it gets very direct, strong inputs from taste and smell, but it also gets projections about visual and auditory input, somatosensory input as well. So it gets all of this information, and what it does is it begins to link them together and associate them with reward value. So I think I gave the example, there's a kid eating a piece of pizza, and it's like, okay, you can picture like what that pizza smells like, what it tastes like, what the texture is like in your mouth, and you make this decision of, do I eat the pizza? Do I eat just one piece of pizza? Do I eat half the pizza? You know, you associate like how the valence, how pleasant is this sensory experience? How much do I want it? What's the gain if I take advantage of this, or if I have this again? So the orbital frontal cortex is involved in decision making based on expected reward or value of something. It also helps by or is involved in comparing. So you eat that piece of pizza and you have this expectation that, you know, it's going to be amazing, and, you know, it turns out to be just all right. That comparison of what you expected to what you actually got is also going on in the orbital frontal cortex. And in that way, it helps us to learn. So maybe next time I just say like, yeah, you can pass on that pizza. And really, I'm talking about pizza, but you can talk about this really in relation to drugs. Because this part of the brain really is involved, in addition to the nucleus accumbens, which we haven't talked about yet, but particularly involved in aspects of addiction, and not just addiction to drugs, but addiction to things like gambling, or sex, or foods. That when does that reward stop? When is that reward enough? And because the orbital frontal cortex is encoding a lot of sensory information, it has to do, and I'm not an addiction specialist, but you guys have heard about, like, if you're trying to quit smoking, that something like even just seeing a lighter or a cigarette butt on the ground can trigger a craving, right? Well, you have these associations of not only, you know, when you smoke, you get the nicotine and you're like, oh, my brain feels good. Again, substitute that with any other drug. But you also have these associations that when I smoke, I light it up with a lighter. When I'm done smoking, I throw the butt into a can or on the ground or whatever. So those other types of sensory associations can trigger that desire for that reward. And again, this doesn't just happen in the orbital frontal cortex, but this is a part of this addiction circuit that we tend to see, and that gets impaired in people with true addiction. Really interesting stuff. We don't have time to go into it anymore today. The other part of the prefrontal cortex that you need to be familiar with, again, is the medial prefrontal cortex. And this is an area that is important in the processing of risk and fear. And it also plays a role in the inhibition of emotional responses and in decision making. So sort of assessing the situation and saying, do I do this? Do I not do this? And again, this is really the main area that's going to link with the amygdala to say, or the, you know, to have those descending inputs on emotional responses, more so than the orbital frontal cortex. Other things that the medial prefrontal cortex is important for are things like learning from mistakes. So I think your book is an example of card sorting or different card games that they would do with people. And one of them also had to do with risk, but it had 4 decks of cards, and they started playing with the first deck. And really the first deck was a losing deck, and the idea was that, okay, if you don't want to play with that deck anymore, then you go to deck 2. And people that had impairments in this area had a hard time learning that this was a bad deck, or understanding making a decision to change strategies. So the ability to sort of shift gear and change strategies is also part of the medial frontal cortex. Another game that they did was they would take decks of cards that had shapes and colors on them, and they would say first sort by shape, and so they could do that. But then they say, okay, now you need to stop, we want you to sort by color. And they had a really hard time shifting gears. They would go back to that initial strategy that they had learned, and when they made mistakes, had a hard time going back and correcting those mistakes. So anyway, those are just paradigms of how people have studied the medial prefrontal cortex. Sorry, Matt, you had a
I was
question?
just going to add a little fun fact about the orbitofrontal cortex. It's also activated very much by listening to music, and it's one of the last areas to go when you have dementia or Alzheimer's. There's a lot of research around that now.
Interesting. And what is the activation of music?
They just did fMRIs, and they would notice that area was like lighting up a lot more than recently. They haven't really studied that area, so they were trying to like find implications for using music to help access memories, or like use that area to access memories in Alzheimer's as well.
Yeah, well, and orbitofrontal cortex is also really involved in OCD, which we'll talk about. So I wonder if then music could be used in some way therapeutically to, because it's under-responsive in people with OCD. So interesting about that. Yeah, thanks. That's a good tip. The last thing about medial prefrontal cortex is that it's important for understanding social norms. And I have judgment on here, but really moral judgments is where it tends to come into play. And there haven't been a lot of studies, I'm sorry, I know we're at time, haven't been a lot of studies on damage to the medial prefrontal cortex in children or pre-adolescents. But the ones that have children or pre-adolescents that have had damage, probably via TBI, to the medial prefrontal cortex tend to have, as they develop, as they grow, very antisocial behaviors and exhibit very poor moral judgment. So that gives us some sense of there is a time frame where these skills, these understanding social norms and morality develop, that if there is brain damage during that time, that those skills may not develop. Now, as adults, if you have damage to the medial prefrontal cortex, you may see some changes in social behaviors. People that used to be able to maintain a social distance now talk too close or do some inappropriate things, but not necessarily to the level of having antisocial behaviors. So again, the timing of damage may be very important. All right, I think that's a good place. I'll say, you guys have heard of Phineas Gage. All right, he had a iron thing projected through his prefrontal cortex. And again, this was one of the initial studies that told us about what the prefrontal cortex does, because he maintained intelligence, speech, motor function, all of that, but had some profound changes in personality, became very capricious or the I don't give a shit syndrome. He had a hard time with social conventions, used profanity, and lacked a sense of responsibility. So it was just sort of one of those, not necessarily a study, but he was studied after the fact, and it gave us a lot of information about why the prefrontal cortex was important. So we'll stop there. We'll hit nucleus accumbens and amygdala when you come back, and we'll talk about disorders of the limbic system as well. So again, you guys know what you're supposed to do for lab. You don't have to stay in your assigned tables or pods if you want to go somewhere else to work. I don't mind. I will be where I normally am, grading quizzes, so if you need me, come and grab me. But if you need to use the computer lab or whatever to develop your PowerPoint slides, I'm just going to assume that you can go wherever you need to go today, and that you'll find me if you need me, okay? Caitlin?
Oh, I had a question.
Assume that's why you had your hand up.
Yeah, it went from my brain. Okay, no, so this is for the whole course, not just the
Day
structures?
1 to last week.
Okay, so that means our lab final will be on every single structure we've learned in the course.
Pretty much, yes. You get 2 days of review though.
That's true.
As you go through this, and any structures, like from